She was Zhang Minggui's substitute, an imitation of the Prince of Jin's first love. In the third year of the Sui era, the Western Han Dynasty, summer. The Zhang manor was veiled by dense trees and enshrouded in their green shadows that obscured its cloister, and consequently, the people that walked through it. Mu Mingtang was dressed in soft blue and fine silver clothing. The two people outside were engrossed in their conversation and did not notice her. Furthermore, her attire was light in color and helped her blend in with the mottled shadows of the surrounding greenery. However, Mu Mingtang knew that the real reason the usually vigilant Prince of Jin had completely let his guard down was due this reunion with his first love. In his elation, he became careless and thus failed to notice Mu Mingtang. I'm sorry for what I did, Brother Ji. I believed in the lies of the barbarians, misunderstood you, and even ran away from home. I am overjoyed that you've been doing well. Otherwise, I would. The woman in white was suddenly overtaken by sadness and began to sob. Her face was free of makeup, and her dress was modest. At first glance, her countenance wasn't particularly captivating, but her beauty was the type that became increasingly prominent the more one looked at her. When her eyes filled with tears that stubbornly refused to fall, anyone would feel distressed for her. Naturally, Xie Suanji was no exception. He couldn't stop himself from stepping closer to her. Although he wanted to hold her, he was afraid it would startle her and thus refrained from doing so. It's all right, Mingwei. Nothing matters more to me than your return. It has been a year, but everything is still the same. The position of the Princess of Jin has always been reserved for you, and only you. At this, the woman, Mingwei, finally burst into tears. But, Brother Ji, I am no longer worthy of you. I was deceived by those barbarians and committed such evil acts. I even suspected your love for me and ran away from our wedding. Over the past year, I spent a lot of time thinking about these horrible things, and the more I thought about them, the more afraid I was to come back. Although I was kidnapped by the barbarians, it was due to my own ignorance. I cannot blame anyone but myself. Seeing that you are well and safe is already for me, I don't dare expect more. I heard that you're engaged now. That's good. I'm sure she will take good care of you in my place. No, Mingwei. Xie Suanji appeared to be panicking. He took another step forward until his body was almost touching hers. He looked down and forced her to meet his deep gaze. I've said before that I would always be waiting for you to come back and take you as my princess. However, since the imperial edict was announced, we could not defy it. Thus, Uncle Zhang adopted a daughter from outside to act as your substitute. The fake will always be the fake, and the real will always be the real. Now that you're back, what need do we still have for the fake? The position of the Princess of Jin has always belonged to you, Zhang Mingwei. But I was kidnapped by the barbarians, and my whereabouts were unknown for a year. Her purity is one of the most important virtues for the women who marry into the imperial family, she said, her expression turning into one of shame as she lowered her head, revealing her slender neck. Although I am still pure, who would believe me? If you took me as your princess, you would be ridiculed. Contrary to her dejectedness, Xie Suanji was thrilled when he heard her words. He had always been a calm and gentle man, but at this moment, he couldn't help but laugh out loud and almost couldn't stop himself from embracing her. Wonderful, that's wonderful. Mingwei, do you know how happy those words have made me? You didn't become the woman of another man. Your body is still pure. Don't worry, I will ensure that no one but you, me, and Uncle and Madame Zhang will know. If an outsider asks, you can say that you were recuperating outside. As for my Emperor father and Empress mother, I will talk to them myself. There will be no issues. Zhang Minggui's cheeks blossomed with a pink hue as he finished speaking. After a moment, she seemed to have thought of something, causing her face to pale, and she gently pushed him away. Brother Ji, I am touched by your feelings, truly, but I am no longer worthy of you. Your future princess is someone else. She is more clever than me, more filial than me, and she wouldn't make my parents angry like I did. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. After mother and father adopted her, they must feel closer to her and think that she's more suitable to be their daughter. Now that the engagement has changed, it is only right for me to walk away. My presence would only delay your marriage and annoy the second young miss. What are you saying, Mingwei? Xue Suanji refuted coldly and without hesitation. I have never held feelings for her, and I've always regarded her as your substitute. Uncle and Madame Zhang are of the same mind. If it weren't for her looks that slightly resemble yours, a lowly refugee like her would never have been able to enter the doors of the Zhang family. She should feel grateful for the year of luxury she enjoyed here. If she forgets her place and dares to target you, however, I would not show her any mercy. Brother Ji, she said tearily. Mingwei, heartbroken by her expression, he finally gave in and pulled her into his arms. Come back. Uncle Zhang and I have been waiting for you all this time. Now, everything can go back to before. Oh, how touching! A shallow smile hung from Mu Mingtang's lips, and the longer she listened, the more she felt like a joke. Zhang Mingwei and Xie Suanji were childhood sweethearts, yet a single misunderstanding was able to tear their relationship apart. Now that they had reunited and reconciled, all that was left for them to do was to get married with the blessings of both their parents and then live happily ever after. What an enviable and tear-jerking story! In this story, Mu Mingtang was the third party, the substitute who didn't know her place and was an outsider from start to end. That's right, the so-called she and the substitute Zhang Mingwei and Xie Suanji were referring to was her, Mu Mingtang. As Xie Suanji had said, Mu Mingtang came from a humble background, especially when compared to the two of them. Xie Suanji was an imperial prince who was granted the title of the Prince of Jin, and Zhang Mingwei was the daughter of a high-ranking official. Meanwhile, Mu Mingtang had been born in Xiangyang. Her family was neither a scholarly family nor an official family, but a merchant's family filled with the stench of copper. Although they weren't wealthy and influential, her parents loved each other, and they didn't suffer from a lack of money. Nurtured by her parents' love, Mu Mingtang blossomed from infanthood to adolescence without much difficulty. Originally, her life should have followed the same track as the lives of most little village girls did. Once the ordinary her came of age, she would marry an equally ordinary man, and form her own, ordinary family. However, when she was 12 years old, her peaceful life was shattered. In the third year of the Hengjia era, Xiangyang was besieged. After a few days of resistance, the northern barbarians broke in full fury. Desperate for his life, the prefecture chief left the large city of Xiangyang and all of its citizens overnight. With him went the elite troops and weapons of the whole city. Consequently, without weapons or command, the citizens were unable to resist as the northern barbarians slaughtered their way through the city. Mu Mingtang's parents died in order to cover her escape. Unfortunately, even then, she failed to escape Xiangyang. After all, the world was filled with ordinary people who could neither fly over eaves and climb up walls with martial arts nor keep calm in the face of danger. During her escape, she was discovered. If it wasn't for the timely arrival of the Marquis of Wuhan, she would have been sent to accompany her parents in the afterlife. After that, along with many other refugees, Mu Mingtang traveled northward in search of a place to live. After the destruction of her home city, she was reduced from being a well-off merchant's daughter to a homeless refugee who could be stepped on any time, and by anyone. It wasn't hard to guess what hardships the beautiful, 12-year-old girl had to suffer from then on. Her journey was difficult, but in the latter half, she met Granny Zhou, who had also lost her home and became a refugee. Granny Zhou vowed to help and protect Mu Mingtang as if she was her own granddaughter, and it was only with her help that the young girl was able to survive for so long. Eventually, Mu Mingtang and Granny Zhou settled down in Chenliu and started a new life together. Although they had started out as strangers, after the long and arduous journey to the north, Mu Mingtang naturally regarded Granny Zhou as her own grandmother. She'd planned to support and accompany her until death. The two depended on each other for everything, whether it was sewing, washing clothes, or weaving bamboo strips. Unfortunately, one day, Granny Zhou fell ill from overworking. Mu Mingtang exhausted everything in her possession to seek treatment for Granny Zhou, but to no avail. When the elderly woman died before the next spring, the devastated girl vowed to give her a proper burial. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. It was said that heroes rose during troubled times, but Mu Mingtang and Granny Zhou were just ordinary people without the strength nor the charisma to make a difference. People like them could only live like mustard grass, forced to resign to their circumstances and muddle by each day. Granny Zhou could not afford to live with dignity when she was alive, so Mu Mingtang hoped that through a proper burial, she would be able to at least enter the afterlife with dignity. Alas, the heavens refused to grant her even this. When Mu Mingtang went to the pawn shop in hopes of being able to sell her possessions and gather enough money for the burial, the owner of the pawn shop took a fancy to her appearance and devised a trap in order to get his hands on her. He accused her in public of being a thief. After all, how could a weak woman like her possess so many pawns? His words angered her so much that she cursed him out right there and then. Her grueling escape from Xiangyang to the north had tempered her mind into one of iron and steel and her tongue into one that spat venom in the form of words. After receiving an earful of merciless insults, the owner of the pawn shop was so angry that he flung himself at her. Naturally, Mu Mingtang was not a pushover. She retaliated by biting and hitting him until they were both rolling on the ground. They continued to fight until a group of well-dressed guards arrived and pulled them apart. When this happened, Mu Mingtang had yet to register what was going on, but she could tell with one glance at the guards' clothing that they were people she couldn't afford to offend. Immediately, she restrained herself and lowered her head, not daring to protest or even breathe too loudly. Soon after, a maidservant came down from a very grand and luxurious carriage. The maidservant's silky hair was wound tight in two buns, and even the soles of her feet were cleaner than Mu Mingtang's face. When she saw Mu Mingtang's appearance, a touch of disdain colored her eyes. She pinched her nose and said, "Be grateful for your great fortune. Come with me, my madam wishes to speak with you." Madam? This title indicated that the person who wanted to speak with her was of high status, not to mention, she owned such a luxurious carriage and was protected by so many guards. Maybe it was someone related to a small official? Mu Mingtang followed cautiously. Later, when she learned of the other party's identity, she realized that she couldn't have been more wrong. The madam was someone related to a mere feudal official but the main wife of one of the three grand ministers. The three ministries were headed by the Minister of Resources, the Minister of Revenue, and the Minister of Civil Affairs. They were second in command after the Grand Chancellor and, in words that Mu Mingtang could understand, almost no different from the Grand Chancellor himself. Mu Mingtang never would have dreamed that a fight on the streets would lead her to become acquainted with the wife of a Grand Minister. Madame Zhang observed her for a few seconds before ordering someone to take her back with them. And just like that, scared and bewildered, Mu Mingtang was brought to the capital. The maidservants spent a long time washing her body, then, on the next day, they dressed her and took her to see Lord and Madame Zhang. After staring at her for a while, Lord Zhang nodded lightly to his wife. "We will do as you said." "Do as she said?" What did Madame Zhang say? Mu Mingtang was thoroughly confused, but not for long. From this moment on, her life was turned upside down. She became the adopted daughter of Zhang Honghao, one of the three grand ministers. Now, this was the true epitome of possessing a high status. Never in her wildest dreams would Mu Mingtang, who had been struggling among the refugees just one day prior, have imagined this kind of fate to find her. The officials, the merchants, and the common people existed on vastly different parts of the same spectrum. There was a time when the Mu family had to bow and move out of the way if they came across someone as trivial as the daughter of a mere scholar in Xiangyang, let alone the daughter of a grand minister. Mu Mingtang's status soared so high and so quickly that it terrified her. As the saying went, those who were born into eminence were indifferent in the face of wealth, while those who were born humble were prone to intoxication. She understood this much too well and was afraid she would make a mistake and lose everything, so she obeyed everything Madame Zhang and the servants said. Later on, she learned that the reason Madame Zhang was in Chenliu that day was to search for her lost first daughter, Miss Zhang Mingwei. The maidservants told her that their first young miss had gotten lost during the Lantern Festival, but even the ignorant Mu Mingtang could tell that something was off about this. When she was just a merchant's daughter, her parents would always arrange for a single maidservant and a nanny to accompany her to the Lantern Festival, let alone the esteemed Madame Zhang for her precious eldest and only daughter. However, Mu Mingtang didn't question it. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. It didn't matter how Miss Zhang got lost, because Madame Jiang's words were not to be refuted. Her search extended all the way from the capital to Chenliu, where she found not Miss Zhang, but Mu Mingtang. At the time, the girl was cursing and fighting a man much larger than her, but even so, after observing her for a while, Madame Zhang was able to notice that both her age and appearance were similar to her daughter's. Mu Mingtang understood her position from the very beginning. Madame and Lord Zhang missed their daughter very much and spent an entire year searching for her, but to no avail. Thus, they adopted a look-alike to console themselves. Wei did. Madame Zhang disdained the vulgarness she'd shown that day on the streets, so she removed the claws and teeth she had honed over the years of hardship and became soft-spoken and obedient, capable of smiling without teeth and walking without noise. She hid her true self and turned herself into a different person. She was afraid of being thrown out. She was afraid of having to return to the precarious life she'd lived among the refugees who were no better than wild dogs. Dignity was useless in such circumstances, let alone staying true to one's true self. After undergoing a year of intensive closed-door training, she finally succeeded in just barely meeting Madame Jiang's expectations. However, while it was simple to change one's skin, the bones that made up one's person were impossible to change. Naturally, she still couldn't compare with Zhang Mingwei, who had been born into wealth and nobility. Nonetheless, a shadow of Zhang Mingwei could be seen in her as long as she just stood still and stayed silent. It was with reluctance that in March, Madame Zhang finally introduced Mu Mingtang to the public. This was when the girl truly understood why the Zhang family had adopted her, and why Madame Zhang was so anxious about her training. It turned out that the prestige the Zhang family held came from not only Zhang Henghao's position as a grand minister but also Zhang Mingwei's engagement to an imperial prince. The emperor's words were law, not to mention he had issued an imperial edict of marriage. It was easy for Zhang Mingwei, whose whereabouts had been unknown since the last Lantern Festival, to escape this, but the same could not be said for her parents. On one hand, they were worried about their daughter, and on the other hand, they were worried about her engagement to the Prince of Jin. As a prince who had been granted a high-ranking title, the Prince of Jin was the most popular candidate for the position of crown prince. If it weren't for the fact that the emperor and the Zhang family were neighbors before he ascended the throne, he would never have granted them such a great honor. When Zhang Mingwei ran away in order to escape the marriage, of course, this was Mu Mingtang's speculation. Despite Madame Jiang's insistence that her daughter had simply gotten lost, this great honor turned into a life-threatening sentence for Zhang Henghao, who flew into a fury when he learned of her disappearance. He claimed that she was no longer his daughter and even refused to send people out to look for her. As a result, Madame Zhang could only grieve over her husband's heartlessness and search for her daughter herself. By the time she encountered Mu Mingtang, she was already at her rope's end and had no choice but to come up with a plan to use her as a substitute. Although she hoped that her daughter would return, they would have to use Mu Mingtang as a substitute if she didn't. After all, the edict was between the Prince of Jin and the Zhang family and didn't specify that the bride had to be Zhang Mingwei. The adopted Mu Mingtang could also be regarded as a daughter of the Zhang family, albeit barely. In March of the next year, Madame Zhang finally gave up all hope for her daughter's return. In April, with their elders as witnesses, Mu Mingtang and the Prince of Jin, Xie Suanji, met formally and tacitly consented to the marriage. With that being said, the Prince of Jin's infatuation with Zhang Mingwei was truly admirable. Even after she ran away from their marriage and was suspected of eloping, he forgave her and went as far as to secretly help Madame Zhang with the search. Then, when time began to run out, he readily agreed to marry the substitute. Even Mu Mingtang was moved by his devotion. As a substitute, she understood better than anyone else that the only reason she was able to enjoy this life of luxury and become a princess was because she bore physical similarities to Zhang Mingwei. Every time Madame Zhang looked at her, she was looking for the shadow of her real daughter. This was already more than enough for Mu Mingtang. She was not greedy enough to expect the Prince of Jin's love on top of everything else. As a matter of fact, she was ready to live the shadow of Zhang Mingwei for the rest of her life. Before her marriage, she would play the role of a good daughter who looked like Zhang Mingwei but was even more gentle. After the marriage, she would do her best to project the image of the Prince of Jin's first love. It wouldn't matter who Mu Mingtang was, what she liked, and who she used to be. However, who would have thought that on the day of the birthday banquet the Zhang family held for Mu Mingtang, Zhang Mingwei would appear? She didn't show herself in public, but when the Prince of Jin suddenly left in the middle of the banquet, Mu Mingtang's intuition had told her that something was wrong. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. Subsequently, she followed him in secret and witnessed the touching display of affection between the two childhood sweethearts. After seeing it, she was reminded once again of how deeply the Prince of Jin was in love with Zhang Mingwei. So, what about her? How were they going to deal with the substitute, the miserable refugee? Advertisements. Turned back. Before she could get far, she bumped into the maidservant who had been sent out to look for her. The latter immediately raised an eyebrow in disdain and scolded, "Second young miss, the madam said that you should refrain from walking around. How could you forget something so simple?" The maidservant's back was facing the trees, so she failed to notice the couple standing between them. Xie Suanji and Zhang Mingwei both stopped talking when they heard her voice. The man's face sunk, and they quickly entered the cloister just in time to see Mu Mingtang disappear around the corner. Truthfully, whether it was her style of dress or the feeling that she gave off, she really did resemble Zhang Mingwei a lot. But he knew that she wasn't Zhang Mingwei. Xie Suanji frowned slightly, wondering why Mu Mingtang was there. Mu Mingtang had never dwelled on it before, but now that she thought about it, even the servants in the manor dared to openly show their disdain of her. She was not noble enough, not elegant enough, not beautiful enough. Yes, because she was a substitute. She was Zhang Mingwei's substitute, an imitation of the Prince of Jin's first love. She would never be good enough, or real enough. The maidservant chattered endlessly, but Mu Mingtang silently ignored her. She was waiting for the Zhang family's next arrangement. However, when night fell, all she got was a cold "Second young miss, this room belongs to the first young miss." The first young miss doesn't like it when other people touch her possessions, so please move out. After a moment, Mu Mingtang stood up and nodded. "That's reasonable. This room belongs to my elder sister. Now that she's back, there is no reason for me to continue living here. I will gather my things immediately." "No," the nanny said indifferently. "Everything in this room, including the clothes and jewelry, belong to the first young miss. You just need to step out, second young miss." Mu Mingtang recalled how the Zhang family had adopted her and provided her with rich food and clothing and endured the humiliation as they moved her from the place she had lived in for an entire year to the cold guest chamber. The time she'd spent as a refugee had taught her the fickle nature of humans and gave her a practical mindset. So what if she was humiliated? It didn't matter as long as she could live well. She thought that since she was being so obedient, someone from the Zhang family would arrive to see her soon. In the end, she realized that she had overestimated herself. They left her in the guest room for 3 days until finally, in the afternoon of the 4th day, someone came to get her. "Second young miss, the Lord has sent for you." Obediently, Mu Mingtang tidied herself up and walked to the study. Zhang Honghao was already seated inside, and, to her surprise, Xie Suanji was also present. She glanced at him very briefly before looking away and softly greeting Zhang Honghao. As for Xie Suanji, she no longer had any reason to concern herself with him. Moreover, Zhang Honghao hadn't spoken, so she couldn't take the initiative to greet Xie Suanji. Zhang Honghao simply nodded before looking at the girl standing in front of him and thinking about the news he was about to deliver. For the first time, he pitied her, then he decided to make up for it by preparing a generous dowry for her marriage that would take place after 2 days. Pleased with his own benevolence, he stroked his beard and said, "You should have heard that your elder sister is back. The bride for the engagement with the Prince of Jin was originally Zhang Mingwei and we had no choice but to use you as her substitute, but now that she's back. Do you understand my intention?" Mu Mingtang meekly bowed her head. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. Yes, this daughter understands. Very well. But rest assured, since you have become my adopted daughter, I will not treat you unjustly. A few days ago, Lord Jin asked His Majesty for permission to let you marry the Prince of Qiyang, and His Majesty agreed to it today. Zhang Honghao continued, smiling, although you were adopted, the Zhang family is by no means a family that favors one daughter over another. After you marry the Prince of Qiyang and become his princess, you and your sister will be related through the imperial family. When that happens, the two of you must remember to look out for each other and uphold my teachings. You are truly fortunate to have this day, Zhang Mingtang. It took Mu Mingtang a few moments to register what Zhang Honghao had said. She would still become a princess, but to the Prince of Qiyang instead? And the underlying meaning was that she, a merchant's daughter who later became a pitiful refugee, should be thankful to the Zhang family for the grace they'd given her? Mu Mingtang slowly raised her head. "Father, isn't the Prince of Qiyang dying? I'll use my future to pay off this 1 year of gratitude." "Dying?" Zhang Honghao frowned. "The Prince of Qiyang is merely in a coma. I heard that a few days ago, he was able to remain conscious at length, showing that the effectiveness of the treatment he is receiving. That is to say, the day the Prince of Qiyang recovers is almost upon us." Mu Mingtang couldn't think of a retort to that. After all, she'd spent her entire first year in the Zhang Manor training behind closed doors, so her knowledge of the outside world was quite limited. As a former merchant's daughter from Xiangyang, what could she possibly know about the circles of high-ranking officials in the capital city? The Zhang family hadn't bothered to teach her these things either, so while she had become their second young miss in name, she barely knew anyone in the capital. As a matter of fact, Zhang Honghao and Xie Suanji were the only 2 men she knew. However, even with her limited knowledge, she knew that becoming the Princess of Qiyang was not a good thing. Although he was also a legitimate imperial prince, the Prince of Qiyang was not the son of the current emperor, but the late emperor. He was an extremely bloodthirsty man who often drifted between the states of consciousness and unconsciousness and went on violent killing sprees whenever he was in the former. The man was so insane that even his own father was nearly killed by him. Obviously, a prince like this could not inherit the throne. Thus, the late emperor passed it to his younger brother, the current emperor, before he died. Since then, the Prince of Qiyang's illness had become progressively worse. It was said that on the day of the enthronement, he slaughtered every person in the Qiyang manor, leaving no one alive. After this incident, the servants of the Qiyang manor were replaced with military men, but even then, the number of people in the manor had to be replaced from time to time. According to the rumors, there was an unwritten rule in the military: anyone who could survive in the Prince of Qiyang's manor for 6 months would be promoted to a higher rank and be awarded 5 kilograms of gold upon their return. However, even with this generous reward, no one was willing to take care of, or rather, keep an eye on the Prince of Qiyang. Supposedly, he had been a part of the military and was known as the god of war on the battlefields. Eventually, he was driven insane by the evil that accumulated from the great number of lives he'd taken. Mu Mingtang didn't know how much of these rumors are true, but she did know that there was no trained soldier who could escape from the Prince of Qiyang's hands, let alone her, a weak woman who'd almost failed to escape from Xiangyang. Did they plan to use her to test the waters inside? It seemed that she would lose her life on the day of her marriage. At this thought, Mu Mingtang became a little restless. She could tolerate insults, cold treatment, and even harsh treatment, but not death. Never. As someone who had barely escaped from it, there was nothing she valued more than her own life. She took a small step forward and said earnestly, "Father, I am endlessly grateful to you and Madame Zhang for saving me from the streets. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. I would like to repay my gratitude by dedicating the rest of my life to serving you both. I don't wish to marry anyone, nor do I desire to be a princess. I am not worthy of such fortune. As long as you allow it, I am willing to stay in the manor and toil like a cow and a horse. I can even be a maidservant. How could we let you do that?" Zhang Honghao refused. "You are my adopted daughter, the second young miss of the Zhang family, not a lowly maidservant. How could possibly we make you become one? Don't worry, with your father here, you can rest assured when you marry the Prince of Qiyang. No one would dare to talk about you behind your back. Moreover, the Prince of Qiyang is a legitimate son of the late emperor. Before the incident happened, he was considered a great hero who had countless young ladies clamoring for him. In any case, marrying him would not serve a disgrace to you." Xie Suanji, who had not spoken once since she entered, closed his folding fan and added, "Father-in-law is right. Ever since my emperor father ascended the throne, he has been working hard and sleeping in fear of betraying the late emperor's expectations. In recent years, he has successfully established a harmony between the court and the people, who are now able to live and work in contentment. The spirit of our empire that was damaged by the long years of war has gradually recovered. However, there is still one thing my emperor father is worried about, and that is my cousin, the Prince of Qiyang. He is the only blood of my uncle remaining in this world. He has reached the age of marriage, yet he still has yet to take a princess or any concubines. Father-in-law then suggested to let you, the second young miss of the Zhang family, become the Princess of Qiyang. My emperor father was relieved to hear this and agreed. After your marriage, you must take good care of my cousin. It would be considered a great merit if you are able to give him an heir." Mu Mingtang had not looked at Xie Suanji since she walked in. This was not only to avoid suspicion but also to draw a clear line between them. She understood very well that despite the pretense he was putting up, Zhang Honghao only regarded Zhang Minggui as his daughter. And Xie Suanji too, just look at him, he was already calling the man his father-in-law. If she were to expect her former fiancé to step forward and entangle with the Prince of Qiyang for her sake, she would undoubtedly become a thorn in the eyes of the Zhang couple and meet a miserable end. Thus, she'd decided to ignore him. However, upon hearing his words, she couldn't help but look over. It was ironic. She was his fiancée only 3 or 4 days ago, yet now, in front of her adopted father, he was telling her to take good care of his cousin and give birth to an heir as soon as possible. Times. Mu Mingtang had thought that even though Xie Suanji held no feelings for her, she had at least played the roles of Zhang Minggui and his fiancé for 3 months. Was it too much to ask for him to give her some face? How could he just watch on as she married a dying man and would probably drag her to be buried with him in the grave? She grit her teeth. The most valuable skill she had learned from the hard years she spent as a refugee was to be shameless. Dignity was something only those who lived with luxury could afford. Mu Mingtang didn't want luxury, she just wanted to live a long and stable life. She quickly lifted her dress skirt and knelt down to kowtow to Zhang Honghao. Father, everything I possess today was granted to me by your kindness and courtesy. You saved me once, so I ask you to save me again. If it was someone else, I would marry him without saying a single word, but the Prince of Qiyang is not an ordinary man. It is known that he delights in blood and slaughter, that in his madness, he would harm even himself. No servants remain beside him, only the trained soldiers of the military. If even those carefully selected men cannot control him, how could I, a feeble girl, protect myself? I'm afraid I would be killed before I am even able to step near him. Father, I do not wish to die. I wish to live a long life serving you and mother. Please, Father, have mercy on me. After saying that, Mu Mingtang lowered her head until it was touching the floor in a sign of deep respect. The sight touched Zhang Honghao, but as soon as he thought of the benefits this marriage could bring to his family, the brief emotion was frozen into indestructible ice. With his face turned away from her, Zhang Honghao sighed and said, I know you are afraid, Mingtang, but rumors are not to be trusted. They are all lies spread by idle people. The Prince of Qiyang is a hero. Although he is delirious now and often attacks others, his treatment has begun to show effect recently. If you take good care of him after you become his princess, he will surely recover. Don't fret about it too much. Seeing Mu Mingtang raise her head and open her mouth to respond, he continued, the emperor's words must be obeyed. Today, during the imperial court session, His Majesty specifically praised and expressed his merriment upon hearing that the second young miss of our Zhang family is willing to become the Princess of Qiyang. Now that the imperial edict has spread throughout the empire, you cannot disobey it. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. Doing so would not only cost you your life but also implicate mine. Do you intend to bite the hand that fed you? Bite the hand that fed her? At this, Mu Mingtang's heart turned cold. Was she wrong for wanting to live? She finally realized Zhang Honghao's determination to sell her. No matter how much she pleaded and how humble she acted, he would not change his mind. The Prince of Qiyang was the legitimate son of the late emperor and the nephew of the current emperor. The fact that the late emperor passed the throne to his younger brother rather than his own son was already suspicious in itself. To this day, the Prince of Qiyang's life was still hanging by a thread. No matter how she looked at it, the current emperor was very suspicious. Mu Mingtang didn't know whether the Prince of Qiyang's condition had anything to do with the emperor, but she reckoned that the emperor was greatly troubled by a guilty conscience and feared that others would say he was mistreating his nephew. Zhang Honghao stepped forward at the perfect time with a solution, offering his adopted daughters in marriage to the Prince of Qiyang. The emperor had not only persisted with the Prince of Qiyang's treatment but also found him a princess. With this, even if the Prince of Qiyang never recovered, no one would blame the emperor for being cruel. The Zhang family would naturally be rewarded for this merit. Perhaps Zhang Honghao would finally be granted a position even higher than the one he held now. The emperor would be able to protect his reputation, the Zhang family would benefit, Zhang Mingwei would get rid of her annoying substitute, and Xie Suanji would be able to please his first love. Everyone would be happy, except her, the sacrifice. Would Zhang Honghao be willing to give up his future prospects for an adopted daughter, an outsider? Naturally, the answer was no. A year and a half had passed since she stepped inside the Zhang manor. Although she was clumsy at first, she'd adapted quickly and tried to please everyone in the manor, including the servants. She'd thought even if the Zhang couple didn't see her as their own daughter, they should have developed at least a little bit of affection for her. After all, if one raised a dog for a year, they would be reluctant to kill it. Times. However, it seemed that she wasn't even as good as a dog. They'd never even regarded her as a human, did they? Her only purpose was to be Zhang Minggui's substitute, and now that Zhang Mingui had returned, they were keen to throw her into the Qiyang manor to squeeze the last bit of value out of her body. When Zhang Honghao saw Mu Mingtang kneeling silently on the ground for so long, he felt his heart ache. After all, she was a delicate-looking girl. When Madame Zhang brought her back, she did resemble Zhang Mingui quite a bit, but over the past year, with their care and nourishment, Mu Mingtang had grown to possess her own type of beauty. If Xiangyang had not been destroyed, if she had not been driven to the capital, Mu Mingtang would have lived a carefree life pampered by her parents. Which parents would be willing to see their young, blossoming daughter marry a dying madman? Zhang Honghao silently sighed and softened his tone. When your sister returned a few days ago, we were unable to properly celebrate your birthday. Later today, I will make it up to you with a gift. As he spoke, he was very pleased with his own generosity as an adopted father. Mu Mingtang should be feeling quite grateful. He waited for her to shower him with words of gratitude, but she remained silent and suddenly stood up instead. At this, Zhang Honghao frowned. As expected, a commoner would always be a commoner. When her father spoke to her, she not only refused to answer but even stood up on her own accord. Times. Did he say she could stand up? How disrespectful! Unlike before, Mu Mingtang didn't apologize and beg for forgiveness at every shift in Zhang Honghao's expression. This time, she grinned, looked between Zhang Honghao and Xie Suanji, and said, "To be sanctimonious and sail under false colors." I didn't understand what these two sayings meant before, but now I get it. Xie Suanji's face suddenly sank, and Zhang Honghao was furious. Presumptuous! What do you think you're saying, Zhang Mingtang? Kneel down and plead for forgiveness this instant. Birthday? Gift? Put away your hypocrisy. My name is not Zhang Mingtang, and my birthday is not in June. The 3rd of June is Zhang Minggui's birthday. Mine has long passed. Zhang Honghao froze. Mu Mingtang's birthday had long passed? Suddenly, he realized that he had never bothered to ask her about her birthday. No one did. They'd simply arranged a birthday banquet for her on the 3rd day of June. The 3rd day of June. Indeed, it was Zhang Minggui's birthday. You went on prating about how marrying the Prince of Qiyang is a great honor, so why don't you let your own daughter have this honor? My life is cheap, I can't afford to accept this honor. Zhang Honghao was about to speak when Mu Mingtang interrupted him, "Spare me your hypocritical sophistry. If you want to kiss up to your boss, you will kiss up your boss. If you want to sell your daughter, you will sell your daughter. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. I know you're not going to change your mind. It's for my own good? Don't give me that crap. Just hearing it makes me cringe." Zhang Honghao was one of the 3 grand ministers. In court, he held a position above nearly everyone else, and as the head of his family, no one, not even Madame Zhang and Zhang Mingui, dared to defy him. That meant no one had ever pointed a finger at his face and called him a hypocrite before. Presumptuous! He slammed his hand on the table and stood up. The Zhang family adopted you, provided you with rich food and clothing, and gave you servants who wait on your hand and foot. Is this how you should be treating your benefactor? If it wasn't for me, you would remain a commoner for your entire life, incapable of even dreaming of becoming a princess. That's right, I don't deserve it. So, did I ask you to adopt me? Did I ask you to make me the princess of Qiyang? Mu Mingtang completely abandoned her facade and glared at Zhang Honghao. This was the real her, the orphan who escaped from Xiangyang to Shenliu, the shrewd woman who dared to fight with the owner of a pawn shop on the public streets. Zhang Honghao could not retort. Indeed, what he had said was filled with awe-inspiring righteousness, but in reality, every decision had been made by the Zhang family alone. Mu Mingtang had inherited the title of their second young miss, but to say that she owed them anything was not entirely accurate. Mu Mingtang was fed up with the pretense. She'd worked hard to repay them for their kindness and keep this hard-earned life of stability, but no matter what she did, they would never see her as a person. How much harder would she have to work? How much more humiliation would she have to take? Now, Zhang Honghao was going to send her to the grave of a dying murderer in exchange for a promotion. Was she still supposed to be grateful? To thank them for making her a princess? As if she, Mu Mingtang, was a vulgar merchant's daughter, a lump of mud beneath their feet. She was incapable of grasping the classic etiquettes of these high-ranking nobles. Mu Mingtang pulled out her hairpin and threw it to the ground. He said, "My father taught me that I can owe anyone anything, but I should never owe anyone a debt of gratitude. Fine, I'll use my future to pay off this 1 year of gratitude. After that, I wish that we never have to cross paths again." The slender hairpin fell to the ground and smashed into pieces. Blue tassel beads scattered and bounced across the floor. Zhang Honghao's expression became impossibly dark. "Never cross paths again? How dare you say that after all of the kindness we've shown you? You are acting as though we took advantage of you. You've learned nothing about benevolence, righteousness, and etiquette, and instead chose to accuse the Zhang family for being unjust to you. Everything you have said is out of anger that we are not providing you with the best marriage. As expected, you are still coveting Ming Gui's things." Mu Mingtang had planned to end everything here today, but at that moment, she exploded. In order to play the role of Zhang Minggui's substitute, she'd had to give up her family name, her background, and even her own personality. Anyone else could say that she was greedy for glory and wealth, but the Zhang family did not have this right. Goaded beyond endurance, Mu Mingtang pointed at Zhang Honghao and said angrily, "You damned dog-shit official, you're saying I covet Zhang Minggui's things? You think your house is made of gold, and everyone wants to kiss up to you? Well, let me tell you, I don't. And do you actually believe that you're such a good man, just because your wife, your little concubines, and your servants like to kiss your ass? Wash your eyes and take a look in the mirror. You're nothing more than a petty, greedy, and self-absorbed hypocrite who sells women for the sake of your own benefit." Everything she had kept bottled up over the past year and a half spilled out all at once. Seeing his father-in-law enraged to the point of speechlessness, Xie Suanji stood up and made to scold her, but Mu Mingtang immediately spun around and glared at him. Raising an eyebrow, she said, "What do you want?" As expected of the Prince of Lovesickness, to still remain so loyal even after your fiancé ran away from you. How very enviable. I hope that you and Zhang Minggui reach old age together and are never separated. Such vulgarness and ignorance. Xie Suanji frowned as though he was looking at something filthy. Times. When Mu Mingtang was still his fiancé, she'd naturally gone out of her way to flatter and curry favor with him, but now that she was about to become his sister-in-law, did he think she would be scared of him? Mu Mingtang sneered and said, "That's right, I'm ignorant and vulgar. What's it to you? I've been wanting to say this for a while now, but you sure like to act all high and mighty, don't you? For what? For who? I treated you sincerely, but you? You were so eager to help sell me to another man. From now on, let's stay out of each other's business, shall we?" As soon as she finished speaking, she turned around to leave. Never in his life had Xie Suanji been insulted like this. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. In his anger, he stretched out his hand and grabbed hold of Mu Mingtang's wrist in a tight grip. The girl immediately cried out, "Scoundrel! What are you trying to do to your sister-in-law?" Xie Suanji was stunned and flinched back as though he had been scalded. She rubbed her throbbing wrist while scolding, "Your Highness, you said it yourself just now. The emperor decreed before the court that I am to become the princess of Qiyang. I am officially your sister-in-law now, so you should show me some more respect. If you dare to touch me again, don't blame me for accusing you of violating your sister-in-law. Returned to the owner. What right does that fake have to become Shui Suankan's princess? After Mu Mingtang said violating your sister-in-law, Xie Suanji's chest heaved with anger, but he dared not do anything to her. When it came to the prince of Qiyang, the emperor was in an awkward position. This was also the case for Xie Suanji, as it was his cousin who should have been the heir to the throne. Everyone knew that the ones who had reaped the most benefits from the prince of Qiyang's illness was the current emperor's family. Nowadays, with the rise of Neo-Confucianism, tolerance for relations between men and women was becoming lower and lower. Brother and sister-in-laws were naturally expected to keep their distance, and it was especially the case for Mu Mingtang because the prince of Qiyang was unconscious and bedridden. Although he was still alive, she was no different from a widow. If she, as a young, pretty widow, were to accuse Xie Suanji of violating her, he would not be able to defend himself. Xie Suanji's face was still red with anger, but he let go of her wrist. Mu Mingtang felt both smug and satisfied when she saw this. A commoner like her was not knowledgeable about politeness and proper etiquette. She only knew that if she was in an advantageous position, she should pursue it to victory. If she were to fall, she would be struck while she was down. Times. Mu Mingtang straightened out her sleeves and laughed. Your Highness, the people know you as a man of virtue, a man as gentle as jade. You should mind your conduct a little more. After all, I am your sister-in-law, and your cousin is still in a coma. If anything were to happen to me, you would drown in the spittle of their whispers. After saying this, she smirked at him and swaggered out. The servant guarding the door moved to block her but froze when she sneered, "Get out of my way. The emperor himself appointed me as the princess of Qiyang. Can you afford to stop me?" Xie Suanji had always portrayed himself as a gentle and courteous man, and every person who saw him had to stop and politely greet him. The women he interacted with were all noble daughters like Zhang Minggui, filled with grace and elegance. When had he ever encountered a shrewd woman like Mu Mingtang? His face was as dark as the bottom of a pot, and Zhang Henghao's face was even worse. Had he known Mu Mingtang's true nature was like this, he wouldn't have requested the Prince of Jin to be present. The fact that she had insulted the Zhang family in front of the Prince of Jin was already humiliating enough, but now she had slighted the Prince of Jin himself. Zhang Henghao was both embarrassed and terrified. When Mu Mingtang was no longer in sight, he quickly went forward and bowed to Xie Suanji. Your Highness, I implore you for forgiveness. My adopted daughter was originally a merchant's daughter. She is crass and low-born with an empty head. Your Highness, you are a magnanimous man. Please do not take the words of a commoner to heart. Xie Suanji nodded. It was an easy offense to forgive, not to mention he had no choice but to forgive her. Just as Mu Mingtang had said, her marriage to the Prince of Qiyang was decreed by the Emperor himself with the entire imperial court as witness. The Emperor had specifically named the second young miss of the Zhang family as the Princess of Qiyang. In other words, even if the Zhang manor was suddenly hit by a meteorite, the rest of the Zhang family would have to ensure that not a single hair on Mu Mingtang's head was harmed. After a few rounds of flowery adulation to appease the Prince of Jin, a maidservant was summoned to serve them tea. Zhang Henghao stroked his beard and said, "Had it not been for your Highness, the marriage between my adopted daughter and the Prince of Qiyang would not have been settled so quickly and smoothly. Please rest assured, Your Highness. Mu Mingtang owes the Zhang family a great debt of gratitude and will naturally pay it back. She is not an insensible girl. If she does dare to resist and must pay with her life, she will do so after entering the Qiyang manor." He was speaking in a very roundabout way to reassure Xie Suanji. After all, Zhang Minggui had escaped from her marriage. If Mu Mingtang were to do the same, the Zhang family would really lose all face. Xie Suanji nodded and replied, "Father-in-law, since Ming Gui is my beloved fiancé, the affairs of the Zhang family are also my affairs. Zhang Honghao was very relieved when he heard this. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. Was there a father in the world that wouldn't be satisfied with a son-in-law who was so devoted to their daughter? When she went missing, he'd even lent a hand in the search. With this, Zhang Honghao could even forgive Zhang Mingwei for running away in the first place. When his thoughts reached this point, he felt a little conflicted. It was difficult for him, as a father, to ask his engaged daughter about such things. She had gone missing for an entire year, not to mention that on the day of her disappearance, he'd heard that she had eloped with a barbarian man. He had no choice but to worry. Naturally, Madame Zhang insisted that their daughter was still pure, and Zhang Honghao didn't doubt her, but that didn't matter. It was a fact that Zhang Minggui's whereabouts had been unknown for an entire year. This was a very difficult indignity to recover from. Zhang Honghao accepted that his daughter was still young and ignorant and thus prone to making mistakes, but what about Xie Suanji? Which man wouldn't care that his fiancé had eloped and lived with a barbarian man for a year? Zhang Honghao almost didn't dare to mention it, but Xie Suanji was a member of the imperial family. In the long term, avoiding this topic would only bring him more harm than good. He paused for a moment and then said in a deliberately natural manner, "Your Highness, you and Ming Gui have been close since childhood. Out of all the children who lived on our street, it was the two of you who got along the best. Later, when our families moved apart and were no longer neighbors, Your Highness's relationship with Ming Gui also grew distant. It is very touching to see the two of you become engaged. We moved to the capital city when the child was at the rebellious age of 14 or 15, and I was busy with the affairs of the imperial court. Her mother refused to leave the child on her own, which not only caused her to become spoiled but also flamed her desire for freedom. When she ran away from home, it was all due to our poor discipline. Your Highness! Father-in-law!" Xie Suanji reached out to stop Zhang Honghao and said, "Our two families have been close to each other since childhood. I remember eating at the Zhang manor many times, and Madame Zhang cared for me like I was her own son. The Zhang family is truly dear to me, and Ming Gui is my childhood sweetheart. We are of the same mind, so how could I possibly doubt her virtue? You need not talk about it anymore, father-in-law. It is not only insulting to Ming Gui but also to my feelings for her. Let bygones be bygones. It is enough that she has returned." Times. A wave of relief immediately washed over Zhang Honghao. He cupped one hand in the other before his chest and then picked up his cup. "Your Highness is truly noble and upright. This official would like to replace wine with tea and present this cup to Your Highness to express my admiration. How could I accept that?" Xie Suanji quickly picked up his own cup and returned the gesture. "I should be the one showing respect to you, father-in-law." The atmosphere in the study was very harmonious, but in the main room of the Zhang manor, it was quite the opposite. "Why?" Zhang Mingwei threw a pearl hairpin to the ground and turned her back. "She is just a lowly refugee. What right does she have to marry the Prince of Qiyang and become the Princess of Qiyang? Oh, you!" Madame Zhang chastised her enraged daughter and picked up the exquisite hairpin before placing them back on the table. "This is the latest style from the Jade Pavilion. A commoner living in the capital would have to work for a year to be able to afford it, not to mention it is not something money alone can buy." Zhang Mingwei couldn't help but think of the dark and desperate days she had lived through in the past year. A simple and crude bed in a foreign palace, locking her in forever. Not long ago, she had been the concubine of Yeluyan, the emperor of Beirong, the land of the northern barbarians. The Zhang family was actually not from the capital city, and Zhang Honghao's position as one of the three grand ministers was not something he had earned through his own efforts. At the beginning, the Zhang family was just an ordinary 8-rank civil official's family from Linan. Although they were better off than a commoner's family, they were by no means wealthy or influential. As a matter of fact, their whole street was filled by people of the same family background. The Xie family, or rather, Xie Rui's family, had lived next door. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. The street they lived on was called Jianan Street. The adults of both families forbid their children from associating with the children of the commoners and merchants, so they only played with the other children on their street. Zhang Minggui and Xie Suanji were of the same age, lived close to each other, and their parents were also acquainted, so naturally, they became childhood friends. Zhang Minggui had always been an attractive girl, even when she was a child. She was outstanding among her peers and very popular with the boys. Xie Suanji was intelligent, tall, and knew how to gather followers from a young age. He was the king of the children in their district. They were two birds of a feather, both similarly talented and beautiful. Out of his own pride, Xie Suanji would always feel annoyed when people made fun of Zhang Minggui, and whenever someone joked about the two of them marrying each other when they grew up, Zhang Minggui would run away blushing. At that time, the Zhang and Xie families were just two small families, and marriage between neighbors was the ideal choice. There was no need to think further. However, there was another reason Zhang Minggui acquiesced with the teasing remarks of marriage her friends always made. There was a rumor in their district that Xie Suanji had a very high-ranking official as an uncle and an outstanding older cousin, both of whom lived in the capital. No one had seen the Xie family's main branch, so this remained a rumor, but for the children, having a relative in the capital was already very impressive. Therefore, Xie Suanji gained the highest position in their circle. Zhang Minggui was arrogant and believed that only such a person was suitable for her, the most beautiful girl in their district. In the third year of the Hengjia era, when she was 12 years old, it happened. Jianan Street was suddenly filled with carriages. A row of majestic guards stood at the door of Xie family's house, declaring that General Xie had issued an order to take his younger brother Xie Rui's family to the capital. It turned out that the rumors about the Xie family were true. Xie Suanji really did have a high-ranking official as his uncle. Under the envious eyes of the group of children, he climbed into the carriage and departed for the capital. Before long, the rest of the people in Jianan Street were also promoted one after another. Zhang Minggui's father was one of them, and their family was transferred to the capital city. It was during this time that Zhang Minggui learned what being a high-ranking official in the capital city truly meant. On the day Zhang Minggui arrived in the capital, Xie Rui's family and Xie Suanji were waiting at the gate of the city to welcome them in. As the adults were exchanging greetings, there was a sudden commotion outside. A young youth on a white horse was riding through the crowd at an alarming speed. The guard on duty noticed the chaos and yelled that those who wanted to enter the city must dismount, but when the horse neared and the youth's face was revealed, everyone fell silent. Zhang Minggui was still trying to absorb the atmosphere of the capital city when this overbearing scene played out before her, frightening her so much that she even forgot how to speak. Just then, Xie Suanji, who was beside her, ran forward and called out, "Second brother." The youth turned back and spared him a prefectory glance before disappearing into the city with his horse. Times. Zhang Minggui remembered that day as though it were yesterday. The youth was named Xie Xianchen. Later, she learned that while Xie Suanji's uncle was indeed a high-ranking official, the entirety of the Xie family's power and influence did not come from Xie Yi, ex-Xie Suanji's uncle. Half of it came from that arrogant and beautiful teenager, Xie Xianchen. When she saw him for the first time at the city gates, he was only 15 years old and yet had already been bestowed the title of Marquis of Wuan. It was said that the number of soldiers under him was equal to that of his father Xie Yi. This struck a hard blow to Zhang Minggui. In Linen, she was a princess, but here, she was only the daughter of a small official. The Zhang family and the Xie family were once on the same level, but after entering the capital, Xie Suanji's status became much higher than hers. She felt inferior. Later, the Xie family rebelled and Xie Suanji became an imperial prince, which only made her feel even more uncomfortable. Therefore, in the first year of the Sui era, when she learned from her parents that the palace intended her to marry Xie Suanji, she finally snapped. At that time, the capital was infiltrated by a barbarian spy, Ye Liuyan, who broke into her bedchamber. Zhang Minggui used her identity as Xie Suanji's fiancée to hide Ye Liuyan, then she was attracted by his warm, generous, and unrestrained temperament and agreed to elope with him during the Lantern Festival. Thinking back, this was a decision she greatly regretted, as it had ultimately robbed her of her life and fortune. In her previous life, after she followed Ye Liuyan to the north, she found out that he was also a prince. No wonder such a large battle had broken out in the capital that day. Since she was brought back to Beirong by Ye Liuyan, the reluctant northern barbarians were forced to accept her as his woman. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. However, it wasn't until an entire year later that she and Ye Liuyan finally engaged in the ambiguous affairs between a man and a woman, and she officially became his woman. However, it was just that. As a person of Han nationality, she naturally couldn't become his princess. Eventually, in order to gain more power to attain the throne, Ye Liuyan took the daughter of a Beirong noble as his princess. The princess was very arrogant and regarded Zhang Minggui, who was born in the Han state, as a thorn in her eye. Zhang Minggui was experienced with how concubines fought and schemed against each other, but not to the savage extent of the princess. All of the malice was straightforward and without concealment. She poured cold water on her in the winter and hid needles in the solace of her shoes. Zhang Minggui was humiliated again and again until she could no longer bear it, but due to the power of the princess's family, Ye Liuyan refused to punish her. He told Zhang Minggui to be patient until he ascended the throne, so she did. However, by then, Zhang Minggui had aged, and her beauty was worn away. As a concubine of Han nationality, the difficulties she would face after she lost favor were self-evident. It was when she was at her lowest point that she heard the Ye Empire had welcomed a new emperor, and the empress was the young miss of Grand Chancellor Jiang's family. The young miss of Grand Chancellor Jiang's family? Impossible. She, the only child of the Zhang family, was in Beirong. How could there be another young miss of the Zhang family? It turned out that her parents had adopted a new daughter named Zhang Mingtang. Now, she was the empress of the Ye Empire. Before she died, Zhang Minggui heard that the Ye Empire was sharpening its swords. Xie Suanji, the new emperor, wanted to move his troops to the north to recover the 16 prefectures of Yanyun. However, he had no outstanding generals under his command, so his plans were placed on hold. According to the rumors, Xie Suanji had been thinking about his childhood sweetheart, his first love, all these years. Even his empress greatly resembled her. The relationship between Beirong and the Ye Empire grew tense as time passed by. Zhang Minggui, who was of Han nationality, was secretly dealt with on a dark and windy night. During her last moments, she experienced a series of flashbacks. The events of the Ye Empire played out before her eyes, revealing to her that everything in her life had been following the plot of a book. Xie Suanji was the main character who gradually rose from being the son of a small official to an imperial prince, and then finally, the emperor. The first half of the book detailed his ascent, while the second half covered his plans to strengthen the military and unite the lands under one empire. His harem was an indispensable part of the book. In it, there were all sorts of women, including the pure first love types, the seductive temptresses, the childhood sweethearts, the exotic princesses, the vicious beauties, and the cold beauties. Zhang Minggui was one of the first loves. She'd died early on and was dearly missed by Xie Suanji throughout his life. When Zhang Minggui saw this part, she realized that she had been declared to be dead after she eloped with Ye Liuyan. After all, there had been no news of her since the Lantern Festival. Xie Suanji missed her so much that he even married a substitute who looked like her and made her his empress. This woman's name was Zhang Mingtang, and she was the adopted daughter of the Zhang family. For Zhang Minggui's sake, Xie Suanji made Zhang Mingtang the empress despite her being born in a humble family. The last moments of Zhang Minggui's life were filled with resentment. She resented the merciless Yeliyuan, the malicious and jealous princess, her young and ignorant self, and the fake who replaced her. If it wasn't for Zhang Mingtang, she, Zhang Minggui, would have become the empress. Xie Suanji's love would have belonged to her. When she was reborn, it was in the year she entered Beirong territory. Without saying a word, she returned home. She was determined to never make the same mistakes again. Why did she follow a barbarian to pursue true love when she had Xie Suanji, the main character, wrapped around her finger? The fake who had imitated her to become the empress should also scram back to where she came from. Zhang Minggui hurried back to the Zhang manor. Regaining her position should be an easy task. After all, the marriage had yet to happen. Sure enough, as soon as she showed up, Madame Jiang's eyes turned red, and Xie Suanji immediately threw aside the fake and asked her where she had been in the past year. Everyone believed that the marriage would be returned to Zhang Minggui, but she wasn't satisfied with just that. Since Mu Mingtang had already obediently relinquished the marriage, Madame Zhang was planning to prepare a simple dowry and then send her away to marry an ordinary official's son. However, Zhang Minggui refused. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. She cried about the grievances she had suffered in the past year and the shock she felt when she learned that her parents had adopted another daughter. She cried until Madame Zhang also burst out in tears, and the onlooking Xie Suanji stepped forward and said that he had a way to deal with Mu Mingtang. This satisfied Zhang Minggui. She sat back and waited a few days for the result, which, to her dismay, came in the news of Mu Mingtang's engagement with Xie Xianchen. No. Zhang Minggui clenched her teeth and said, "She is just a merchant's daughter who lived among the refugees for a year. Who knows whether she is still clean or not? What right does she have to marry Xie Xianchen and become his princess?" The Prince of Qiyang, Xie Xianchen. Unclean? Madame Zhang became strangely silent when she heard this. Ever since her daughter returned, Madame Zhang had been deliberately avoiding this topic. After all, which mother would doubt her daughter's purity? Moreover, Zhang Minggui had always been a strong and high-spirited girl. Her development should have been the best among her peers. That is, until she eloped with a barbarian man. Beirong and the Ye Empire were mortal enemies. If it weren't for the fact that she was just a frail girl, Zhang Minggui would have been executed for treason. Moreover, her disappearance had persisted not for a mere 1 or 2 months, but for over a year. A beautiful young miss from an eminent family had wandered alone in the chaotic world for a year and 4 months. Even Madame Zhang had felt a thump in her heart when she heard this. However, since her daughter had returned unscathed and hinted that she was still pure, Madame Zhang decided to not overthink or pursue it. For her, it was already enough that her daughter had come back alive. Now that Zhang Minggui was criticizing Mu Mingtang for being unclean, Madame Zhang didn't know how to respond. Both girls had wandered alone in the outside world for over a year, but no one had doubted the latter's innocence. Mu Mingtang had followed the refugees north and fled to Yingtian. One could sigh at the girl's hard life, but no one would question whether or not had she been taken advantage of on the road. After all, every one of the survivors had to be competent, iron-willed and quick-witted if they wanted to keep their life during such troubled times. On the other hand, Zhang Minggui was a sheltered girl who ran away from home. How could her situation compare to one of a desperate escape from a war-ridden city? Even her own family was skeptical about her purity. When Zhang Minggui noticed that her mother had fallen silent, she looked at her strangely before realizing what she was thinking. Zhang Minggui's face suddenly turned red and then white with anger. "Mother, are you doubting my purity?" "I'm not. You think I'm no longer pure?" Zhang Minggui immediately erupted, wide-eyed and furious as she yelled, "I risked my life to escape from Beirong, to return to my family, only to learn that you and father had adopted another girl to replace me. You gave her my room, my identity, and even my engagement. Now, you think I'm too dirty to be the Zhang family's daughter, right? Mother. No. Madame Zhang shook her head as she began to sob. After you left, I couldn't find any news about you. I scoured Shenliu to no avail, and I thought I would never see you again. When you came back unharmed, I immediately thanked the heaven for its benevolence. How could I doubt my own daughter? Zhang Mingwei realized that there were tears streaming down her own face. She had yelled at Madame Zhang just now, but it was unreasonable, as none of those grievances had happened to her in this current life. She recalled all the hardships she had gone through in Beirong, and the result that came out of it. In the end, she was killed in secret by a drugged handkerchief. The more she thought about the discrimination and abuse she had suffered, and the position of empress she had passed by, the more she aggrieved she felt. Finally, she covered her face and began to sob. Madame Zhang didn't expect her words to trigger such a strong reaction. Seeing her daughter crying so bitterly, she felt as though several knives were stabbing into her heart. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. What kind of unimaginable things did Zhang Mingwei suffer outside for her to cry like this? At this point, even if she had come back with a barbarian's offspring, Madame Zhang would have accepted it. She used her handkerchief to wipe Zhang Mingwei's tears before enveloping her tightly in her arms. It's okay, Mingwei. Don't cry. You're home now. It's all over. Zhang Mingwei's tears slowly stopped. Yes, it was all over now. Xie Suanji chose to believe her and did not pursue her elopement. She would become his princess. Looking at the contrast between the past and the present, she was once again reminded of how blind she had been in her previous life for giving up such a good fiancé. Fortunately, she woke up in time. The first young miss of the Zhang family was still her, and the princess of Jin was also her. Xie Suanji had already discussed with Zhang Honghao about telling the public that she had merely been recuperating from an illness somewhere during the time she was missing. Now, she possessed a fiancé who regarded her as his first love, a noble and distinguished family, and her youth and beauty. The only thing Zhang Mingwei disliked was Mu Mingtang. No one liked to be imitated, especially if it was to the extent of her every mannerism and appearance. The thing that Zhang Mingwei found to be the most disgusting in both of her lives was this fake of hers. A small part of her unspeakable disgust for Mu Mingtang was out of trauma. After all, in her previous life, Mu Mingtang married Xie Suanji instead and became the empress while Zhang Mingwei herself was met with a miserable end. Fate was something people would rather believe in than reject. When she was journeying back, Zhang Mingwei had already decided that as soon as she returned, she would drive Mu Mingtang out. Mu Mingtang would continue to pose a threat to her for as long as she stayed in the Zhang family, but there would be nothing to worry about if she became a commoner. When her tears finally dried, Zhang Mingwei took her mother's hand and said, "No, mother. It's my fault for worrying you." "What are you saying, silly child?" Madame Zhang patted her daughter's hand. "How could I blame you, my child? I will be happy as long as you live the rest of your life peacefully with the Prince of Jin. He is truly devoted to you. I used to believe that he was just a polite and sensible child, but who knew he actually held such deep feelings for you? With such a loving husband, as well as the position of his princess, the days ahead will not be bad. The future of our family will also depend on you." This implied many things. Xie Suanji was already an imperial prince, so if everything went well, he would eventually become the emperor. Zhang Mingwei lowered her gaze. After a while, she said, "Mother, Xie Xianchen really won't be waking up." At the mention of Xie Xianchen, Madame Jiang's expression suddenly became severe. She was silent for a moment before slowly shaking her head. "It is only a matter of time. The emperor is afraid that the people would condemn him for mistreating his nephew if Xie Xianchen died, so he spared no effort to preserve his life. When Shui Xianchen woke up a few years ago, he could still win in a fight of 1 against 10. The soldiers residing in the Qiyang Manor were replaced regularly. However, since the start of this year, the time he is able to stay conscious has been getting shorter and shorter, and he can no longer defeat the soldiers. It is evident that his end is near. Nowadays, outsiders saw only the eminence of the Zhang family and the nobility of the Prince of Jin, not knowing that they had both started out as small official families from Linen. The real nobles were from the Xia family's main branch of the current emperor's brother, Xia Yi. When war was still raging on, the brothers went about their separate ways. The younger brother, Xia Rui, became a 7-rank civil official in Linen, while the elder brother, Xia Yi, joined the military. Under the command of General Guo Rong, Xia Yi made numerous military exploits. When the emperor at the time grew distrusting of Guo Rong's power, Guo Rong decided to take his regime and overthrow the throne, becoming the emperor himself. After Guo Rong ascended the throne, Xia Yi was naturally appointed to a high-ranking position. He was Guo Rong's confidant, and when Xie Xianchen was born, Guo Rong loved him even more than he loved his own son. The Xie family's power expanded rapidly from there and required people to help manage it, so Xia Yi ordered for his brother's family to be transferred from Linen. When Xia Rui arrived and mentioned his former neighbors and colleagues to Xia Yi, it took only one wave of Xia Yi's hand for everyone in the district to be promoted and moved to the capital to enrich his power. When the Zhang family first arrived in the capital, Xia Yi and Xie Xianchen were shining so brightly. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. The latter was a 15-year-old marquis who possessed both outstanding looks and a boundless future. The Zhang family could only stand from afar to witness his glory. Unfortunately, less than 2 years later, Guo Rong died, and his son succeeded him. As the two most powerful men in the capital, how could Xia Yi and Xie Xianchen lower themselves to obey a child? Xie Xianchen started a rebellion, but Xia Yi fought to suppress it. It was said that during the rebellion, Xia Yi hesitated. In that moment, Xie Xianchen took the imperial robe and put it on Xia Yi, then he commanded his regime to kneel and hail his father as the new emperor. With that, Xia Yi was forced to take his own soldiers and attack the capital. The man who was supposed to stop the rebellion became a rebel himself. Guo Rong had rebelled against the previous emperor, and now, his confidant, was rebelling against the Guo imperial family. After that, Xia Yi ascended the throne and became emperor, changing the name of the empire to the Ye Empire. Following this development, Xie Suishan, Xie Rui, and Xie Suanji were all bestowed a title. From start to end, Xia Yi and Xie Suishan were the true protagonists of this story. The Zhang family, Xie Rui, and Xie Suanji were only minor characters who rode on their coattails. However, after Xia Yi claimed the throne, the empire saw many drastic changes. Xie Xianchen, who had made significant contributions to the emperors of both reigns, was ordered to attack the southern Tang Empire. The southern Tang Empire was destroyed, along with Xie Suankan's sanity. The exact events of that day were unclear, but it was said that Xie Suankan's eyes turned red and he began to attack his own regime. All of his close comrades were killed, and the camp was dyed in blood. It wasn't until Xie Suankan's body was exhausted from the slaughter that the survivors finally managed to hold him down. When the news reached the capital, Xia Yi was shocked. He immediately set out to see his son, and as a good brother, Xie Rui naturally went with him. However, even though he was tied up and unarmed, Shui Xianchen managed to slaughter everyone around him and almost took his own father and uncle's lives as well. After Xia Yi managed to bring his son back, he immediately ordered for him to be locked up in the palace. His hands and feet were to be chained with black iron cuffs, and no one was allowed to release him without his permission. The order was issued in a moment of anger, but Xie Suankan's condition never improved. When he was conscious, no one could subdue him. The only thing they could do was send people in one after another to exhaust his strength until he fell back into a coma. Although the time he remained conscious became progressively shorter, his lethality could never be underestimated. The god of war, the prince of Qiyang Xie Xianchen, the flag of the Ye Empire, met his downfall so abruptly. At his peak, the people of Ye Empire could scare away their enemies by just saying Xie Suanken's name. Alas, in the end, this sharp sword turned against his people and slaughtered his own comrades. He was no longer the god of war, but a criminal. Xie Yi ordered for his son to be locked up, while he himself was also dealt a heavy blow when an old illness relapsed. One night in the second year of the Jianxi era, when his heart was heavy, he called his brother into the palace for a talk. No one knew what had happened that night, but Xie Yi suddenly fell ill and died. Before he died, he left an imperial edict saying to pass the throne to Xie Rui. The master of the empire suddenly changed again. Xie Rui ascended the throne and vigorously promoted his own people. They were all civil officials, just like him in the past. After the new emperor took over the Ye Empire, the military officials who had been under Xie Yi and Xie Xianchen were marginalized one after another. Xie Rui emphasized literature but despised martial arts. Xie Suanji also took the place of his cousin Xie Xianchen and became the successor of the throne. It was during this time that Zhang Honghao was promoted to one of the three grand ministers. A change of sovereign always brought about a change of ministers. While the civil officials praised Xie Rui and Xie Suanji to the heavens, the high-ranking officials who rose to power during the previous reign were all demoted. Xie Suanken's reputation of winning every battle he took part of and Xie Yi's contributions to the founding of the empire were gradually forgotten by the people. Now, whenever the people spoke about the Prince of Qiyang, they would only remember that he was a bloodthirsty madman who was on the verge of death. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. Therefore, the Qiyang Manor became known as an inauspicious place. Ordinary people went out of their way to avoid it. However, the current emperor, Xie Suanji, and the entire Zhang family, people who had seen Xie Suanken's past glory with their own eyes, still harbored a sense of fear for him. But there was also awe. That was why Zhang Mingwei was so indignant. What right did Mu Mingtang have to marry Xie Xianchen? Nowadays, no one remembered the origins of the Zhang family, who carried themselves with the arrogance of nobility who were born into great prestige. However, before Xie Xianchen and the members of the genuine high-ranking officials, they were vain. Furthermore, Zhang Mingwei secretly harbored some ambiguous thoughts about Xie Xianchen. Ever since she saw him at the city gates when she was 12, he had become her definition of beauty and wealth. In those days, the Marquis of Wuan, who later became the Prince of Qiyang, was very famous. Although Xie Suanji was also praised by many people, he was still far from Xie Xianchen during his peak. Perhaps all outstanding people should die early, so they would never have the chance to fall from grace. Zhang Mingwei could lament Xie Suanken's downfall, but she could not tolerate him getting married. The young hero in her heart should remain standing at the peak of that untouchable mountain. If she couldn't have him, then no other woman could. Not to mention that woman was the crude, lowly, and despicable Mu Mingtang. Looking at her daughter's expression, Madame Zhang could roughly guess what she was thinking. She sighed and tightly gripped her hand. Mingwei, the Prince of Qiyang doesn't have much longer to live. The reason His Majesty agreed so readily to let Mu Mingtang become the Princess of Qiyang and even ordered the Ministry of Rites to do it quickly is because he fears that the Prince of Qiyang would not be able to live past the next few months. Zhang Mingwei was surprised. He only has a few months left. Madame Zhang nodded silently. Zhang Mingwei also fell silent for a few moments, then she sighed. Madame Zhang understood Zhang Mingwei's feelings very well. That year, such a dazzling figure fell from the clouds overnight and was put under house arrest by his own father. In the end, he lost even his dignity. Who wouldn't lament such a thing? Following the silence, Madame Zhang continued to persuade her daughter. Mingwei, there is no need to be indignant. Although Mu Mingtang will become a princess, her position cannot compare with yours. She is marrying to become a widow. If she ends up dying in the hands of the Prince of Qiyang, she would be considered a martyr for her husband and be praised by the people after her death. If she survives, it would only be a matter of time before the Prince of Qiyang dies, and she falls to the mercy of the Emperor. The Prince of Qiyang is the son of the previous Emperor. There is no telling whether His Majesty would tolerate the widowed princess of the original heir to the throne. When that time comes, Mu Mingtang would be better off being buried alive with her husband. At least then, she would be known as a devoted wife. Zhang Mingwei was slowly convinced. She recalled how, in her previous life, she had not once heard of the Prince of Qiyang's name after she went to Beirong. She reckoned that he had died 1 or 2 years prior and completely disappeared from the world. Later on, when Xie Xuanji ascended the throne and turned the development of the empire toward art and literature, the glory of the military prodigy was further forgotten. Her mother was right. Why was she bothering to compete with a cannon fodder who was destined to meet a bad end? It was true that Mu Mingtang would become a princess, but if Xie Xianchen only had a few months left like her mother said, wouldn't Mu Mingtang become a widow as soon as she entered the Qiyang manor? Then, she would be a childless widow, a powerless princess without anyone's support and backing. Zhang Mingwei would be able to do anything she wanted with her. After coming to this conclusion, she nodded to her mother. "You're right, mother. I was foolish." Madame Zhang was overjoyed to see her daughter successfully change her mind. Then, she pulled Zhang Mingwei to the side and happily showed her a large selection of jewelry and clothing. "You will be marrying the Prince of Jin. This is the dowry I prepared for you, but if you like another style, just say the word and I will have it ready." Zhang Mingwei looked at the chests of pearl ornaments and exquisite silk fabrics before her and couldn't help but smile. This was just the beginning. There was plenty more glory and wealth waiting for her when she became the Empress. When she returned to her own bedchamber, she looked at the familiar furnishings around her and suddenly let out a sigh. Mu Mingtang had lived here for a year, but there was no trace of it at all. Everything was still hers. With a smile, Zhang Mingwei picked out a box of jewelry from her dressing table and called a maidservant in. She said, "Is the second young miss still living in the guest room? It's been hard on her. Give these to her and tell her they're from her elder sister as a gift to congratulate her on her engagement." The man who was supposed to stop the rebellion became a rebel himself. Guo Rong had rebelled against the previous emperor, and now, his confidant, was rebelling against the Guo imperial family. After that, Xie Yi ascended the throne and became emperor, changing the name of the empire to the Ye Empire. Following this development, Xie Xueshan, Xie Rui, and Xie Xuanji were all bestowed a title. From start to end, Xie Yi and Xie Xueshan were the true protagonists of this story. The Zhang family, Xie Rui, and Xie Xuanji were only minor characters who rode on their coattails. However, after Xie Yi claimed the throne, the empire saw many drastic changes. Xie Xianchen, who had made significant contributions to the emperors of both reigns, was ordered to attack the southern Tang Empire. The southern Tang Empire was destroyed, along with Xie Xuanken's sanity. The exact events of that day were unclear, but it was said that Xie Xuanken's eyes turned red and he began to attack his own regime. All of his close comrades were killed, and the camp was dyed in blood. It wasn't until Xie Xuanken's body was exhausted from the slaughter that the survivors finally managed to hold him down. When the news reached the capital, Xie Yi was shocked. He immediately set out to see his son, and as a good brother, Xie Rui naturally went with him. However, even though he was tied up and unarmed, Xue Xianchen managed to slaughter everyone around him and almost took his own father and uncle's lives as well. After Xie Yi managed to bring his son back, he immediately ordered for him to be locked up in the palace. His hands and feet were to be chained with black iron cuffs, and no one was allowed to release him without his permission. The order was issued in a moment of anger, but Xie Suankin's condition never improved. When he was conscious, no one could subdue him. The only thing they could do was send people in one after another to exhaust his strength until he fell back into a coma. Although the time he remained conscious became progressively shorter, his lethality could never be underestimated. The god of war, the prince of Qiyang Xie Xianchen, the flag of the Ye Empire, met his downfall so abruptly. At his peak, the people of Ye Empire could scare away their enemies by just saying Xie Suankin's name. Alas, in the end, this sharp sword turned against his people and slaughtered his own comrades. He was no longer the god of war, but a criminal. Xie Yi ordered for his son to be locked up, while he himself was also dealt a heavy blow when an old illness relapsed. One night in the second year of the Jianxi era, when his heart was heavy, he called his brother into the palace for a talk. No one knew what had happened that night, but Xie Yi suddenly fell ill and died. Before he died, he left an imperial edict saying to pass the throne to Xie Rui. The master of the empire suddenly changed again. Xie Rui ascended the throne and vigorously promoted his own people. They were all civil officials, just like him in the past. After the new emperor took over the Ye Empire, the military officials who had been under Xie Yi and Xie Xianchen were marginalized one after another. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. Xie Rui emphasized literature but despised martial arts. Xie Suanji also took the place of his cousin Xie Xianchen and became the successor of the throne. It was during this time that Zhang Honghao was promoted to one of the three grand ministers. A change of sovereign always brought about a change of ministers. While the civil officials praised Xie Rui and Xie Suanji to the heavens, the high-ranking officials who rose to power during the previous reign were all demoted. Xie Suankin's reputation of winning every battle he took part of and Xie Yi's contributions to the founding of the empire were gradually forgotten by the people. Now, whenever the people spoke about the Prince of Qiyang, they would only remember that he was a bloodthirsty madman who was on the verge of death. Therefore, the Qiyang Manor became known as an inauspicious place. Ordinary people went out of their way to avoid it. However, the current emperor, Xie Suanji, and the entire Zhang family, people who had seen Xie Suankin's past glory with their own eyes, still harbored a sense of fear for him. But there was also awe. That was why Zhang Minggui was so indignant. What right did Mu Mingtang have to marry Xie Xianchen? Nowadays, no one remembered the origins of the Zhang family, who carried themselves with the arrogance of nobility who were born into great prestige. However, before Xie Xianchen and the members of the genuine high-ranking officials, they were vain. I want everything that Zhang Minggui is getting. Second young miss, this is a gift from the first young miss. Mu Mingtang opened it and saw that it was a box of gold jewelry. Almost everything inside was exactly the type of gaudy accessories that Zhang Minggui disliked. However, Mu Mingtang immediately closed the lid and hugged the box to her chest. Although she is older than me, I am, after all, her sister-in-law. In terms of seniority, I am higher than her. She doesn't need to be so courteous with her own family. Even as she said this, she did not loosen her grip on the wooden box. The maidservant was rendered speechless. Not too long ago, she had been serving Mu Mingtang. When Mu Mingtang settled into Zhang Minggui's bedchamber, all of the maidservants around her were also Zhang Minggui's old maidservants. It was conceivable that these maidservants were even more critical of Mu Mingtang than Madame Zhang was. Now that Zhang Minggui had returned, they were finally able to go back to serving their real master. Mu Mingtang stood face to face with the maidservant. At this point, they were both tired of seeing each other. The maidservant disdained Mu Mingtang and thought that only an ignorant girl like her would like such an extravagant hairpin, while Mu Mingtang was wondering if Zhang Minggui had a problem with her eyes. Those high-quality jade and gemstones she liked were indeed nice to look at, but would it sell for as much as gold during times of poverty? Gold was undoubtedly the best. Just look at this beautiful, golden color. The maidservant looked away and said, "You are being too polite, second young miss. The madam is currently preparing the first young miss's dowry. She will soon become the princess of Jin and cannot afford to embarrass herself when she is in public. These hairpins are not suitable for her position, so she no longer needs them and thought that you may be able to use them, second young miss." "That's right, I can use all of them." Mu Mingtang carefully put the box away and said, "Unfortunately, I, her sister-in-law, possess nothing to give back to her. I can only wish the first young miss and the Prince of Jin an everlasting marriage." "All right, you can go now." If Mu Mingtang had any moral integrity left, she wouldn't have accepted this act of charity from the Zhang family. Who would have expected her to just take it without saying a word? The maidservant was so enraged by her shamelessness that she turned around and left without saying another word. By now, Mu Mingtang had completely given up on maintaining her mask and image in front of the Zhang family. She had no need for those things anymore. After she pointed her finger at Zhang Henghao's nose and scolded him for being a hypocrite, Zhang Mingwei gifted her a box of gold. Why wouldn't she take it? She didn't need moral integrity. She only needed money. Once the maidservant was out of sight, Mu Mingtang stood up and gave her precious box of gold a new hiding place. The fact that she was moved to the guest chamber meant she had completely lost the Zhang family's favor, and anyone could take advantage of her. However, for Mu Mingtang, this life was much better than the life she lived in the previous year. Before, she was like a puppet. She wasn't allowed to take large strides when she walked or raise her voice when she spoke. During meal times, she had to take small bites of her food and chew 7 times per bite before she could swallow. Whenever she made a mistake or did something without thinking about it first, the nanny would immediately give her a long scolding. Mu Mingtang was fed up with the nanny's constant squawking. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. Now, she was living in a quiet guest chamber. There were no maidservants around to judge her, and she could do whatever she wanted without the nanny breathing down her back. Other than to give her 3 meals a day, no one came in to bother her. It was such a good life. The box of gold actually delighted her so much that even the humiliation and anger she had received from Zhang Henghao earlier was completely erased. If someone wanted to insult her with gold every day, they could be her guest. She would invite them to trample her dignity to the ground. Suddenly, she remembered that she still needed to remind the Zhang family to prepare her dowry. Since Zhang Henghao had sold her for a high price, she would need to make sure to squeeze every bit of money out of him. The next morning after Zhang Henghao left for his imperial court duties, Madame Zhang happily called in several fabric shopkeepers to help her choose the fabrics for Zhang Mingwei's wedding. Zhang Mingwei disliked bright colors, but she had to wear red for the ceremony and the many formalities after that, and Madame Zhang planned to select the fabrics for everything on the same day. The different shopkeepers gathered around Madame Zhang as they showered her with flowery praises. One of them unfurled a roll of fabric and showed her its luster from all angles. "Madame Zhang, this one is our best product. Not only is it a flawless color but there are also subtle auspicious greetings woven exquisitely into the fabric." When the shopkeeper turned the fabric to showcase the embroidery, Madame Zhang gasped in wonder. Another shopkeeper, unwilling to lose to the competition, quickly pulled out one of her own products to show Madame Zhang. The embroidery is indeed subtle and exquisite, but it cannot be seen from afar. "Madame Zhang, take a look at our fabric. This fabric is tri-layered, the color ripples under the sunlight and changes at night time. How extraordinary!" Mrs. Zhang sighed heartily and turned her head from left to right, admiring both of the fabrics. The embroidery is auspicious, while the tri-layered fabric is beautiful. How could I possibly choose one? If the madam is unable to choose between one, then you should just buy both of them. Madame Zhang looked up in surprise. The maidservant who was trying to block Mu Mingtang from entering gave up and bowed deeply. "I'm sorry, madam." This servant couldn't stop the second young miss. The maidservant felt aggrieved. She had clearly said that the madam was not free, but Mu Mingtang didn't care. A scholar could not argue with a soldier. Most of the maidservants were used to serving the high-class nobilities and had never dealt with someone like Mu Mingtang. By the time she broke into the room, the maidservant was still trying to catch up with her. Looking at the maidservant's expression, Madame Zhang could roughly guess what had happened. She waved her hand and said, "You are dismissed." After bowing again, the maidservant quickly fled. As if she couldn't feel the stares at all, Mu Mingtang stepped forward and touched the fabrics. "Oh, this is indeed nice. It's like running my hand through water. I think both of them are good, so why don't you buy both of them, mother?" In her embarrassment, Madame Zhang failed to respond immediately. The shopkeepers looked at each other and then bowed with smiles on their faces. "Greetings, second young miss." These women specialized in doing business with the noble wives of the capital and were naturally very skilled at adjusting to changing circumstances. "Ladies, there's no need to be so polite. Please, get up." Mu Mingtang didn't feel bothered at all by the tense atmosphere in the room. After generously telling the shopkeepers to get up, she smiled and said, "My elder sister and I will be getting married very, very soon, so we must make haste. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. We will have to trouble you ladies to do some legwork for us." "We?" Madame Zhang frowned delicately, but since they were in front of other people, she could only cough softly and say, "Mingtang, I am preparing your sister's dowry today. There is no rush." "No rush." Mu Mingtang rubbed her fingers reluctantly on the cloth, let go, and then said, "I am to be married to the Prince of Qiyang. Since the Prince of Qiyang and the Prince of Jin are both imperial princes and also cousins, I had assumed that my dowry would be the same as my elder sister's." "The same?" What was she talking about? Madame Zhang grew anxious as she hinted lightly, "Respect for seniority must be upheld. Your sister is the first daughter, after all, so I'm afraid it would not be possible for your dowries to be the same." "Not impossible." Mu Mingtang laughed and retorted, "The Prince of Qiyang is the first son of the late emperor. Even the current emperor has said that he regards him as his own son. In terms of seniority, the Prince of Qiyang is also higher up than the Prince of Jin, so how could you say that, mother?" Madame Jiang's face became ugly. She pursed her lips and glanced at several shopkeepers. They immediately bowed and said, "It is not appropriate for us to stay any longer, so we shall take our leaves first. Have a safe trip back, ladies." Mu Mingtang bid them farewell with a smile on her face and even waved her hand at them. "It wasn't easy for you ladies to bring these fabrics here, so you can just leave them. I like them all. How much is it all together?" "Well, no matter. You can put it on the tab for the time being, Madame Zhang will settle the bill later." The shopkeepers peeked at Madame Jiang's expression. It was on the verge of exploding. "Zhang Mingtang, that's enough. My surname is Mu." Mu Mingtang raised her arm, brushed off the non-existent dust on her sleeve, and arched an eyebrow. "Does I, as the Princess of Qiyang, lack even this much power? Times." Now, Madame Zhang had no choice but to look at the shopkeepers and say, "Do as she says." The shopkeepers immediately smiled, praised Madame Zhang for her generosity, wished Mu Mingtang happiness in her marriage, and fled as quickly as their feet could take them. Once they were alone, Madame Jiang's face sank all at once. "What are you trying to do? You shouldn't forget your place. Don't think that just because you've become the Princess of Qiyang, you can trample over the Zhang family as you wish." "Oh, that's right." Mu Mingtang laughed and said, "It was Madame Zhang who suggested that I be married off to the Prince of Qiyang, wasn't it? How come when the time came for my dowry to be prepared, Madame and Lord Zhang suddenly seemed to have lost their memories?" "You?" Madame Zhang pointed an angry finger at Mu Mingtang, who regarded it with a look of disgust on her face and continued, "Who do you think you are looking down on right now, madam? Is this how you should be treating the future princess of Qiyang? The emperor said that the marriage between myself and the prince of Qiyang should be a grand ceremony, even better than the marriage because my elder sister and the prince of Jin. Neglecting my dowry would be the same as disobeying the emperor's edict. Remember, I want everything that Zhang Minggui is getting. If I find that there's something missing, I'll cut my hair and become a nun. When the sedan chair comes and there's no bride to sit inside, you can push your precious daughter to take my place." As soon as she finished speaking, she snorted and left the room, leaving Madame Zhang so angry that she clutched her chest and couldn't speak. Seeing this, the maidservants in the room cried out, "Madam," and rushed forward. Who would have expected that as soon as this happened, Mu Mingtang would suddenly walk back into the room. She casually approached the rolls of fabric on the table and picked one up. It was heavier than she expected. She wouldn't be able to carry many of them on her own. Turning her head, she pointed to 3 of the strongest-looking maidservants before ordering, you, and you, grab the rest of these fabrics and come with me." When she took 2 steps forward and noticed that there was no movement behind him, she looked back and narrowed her eyes. "I am the princess of Qiyang. Do you intend to defy the imperial edict?" "We wouldn't dare." The maidservants quickly glanced at Madame Zhang before lowering their heads and going forward to help Mu Mingtang. The feeling of abusing one's power was not bad. She snorted triumphantly and threw a few more sentences over her shoulder as she left. There will be no this inserted audio clip if you buy the software license key or activation key. I like the color red bed. It's such a festive color. Be careful. If any of the fabrics fall or get dirted, I'll make you take responsibility for it. After Mu Mingtang left with the rolls of red fabric, the head maidservant immediately went to Madame Jiang's side and supported her anxiously. "Madam! That despicable girl! She won't be able to act like this for long." Madame Jiang yelled angrily, then she clutched her chest and fell down again. The maidservant quickly held her up. "Please calm your anger, madam. It is detrimental to your health."